Most people, and maybe the rest of us here this morning, most of us here this morning, we don't. If you've got good friendships, if you've got good health and plenty to eat, if you're well nourished, if you're leading a full life, if you have enough money to not only cover your basic needs, but even some of your wants as well, I don't think you get it. I think most of us don't get heaven. And here's kind of the core of my message this morning. It kind of rests on this conviction. I think that the only way that you and I can really understand heaven is to learn to take Sabbath rest seriously. The only way that you and I are ever going to get heaven, understand it, comprehend it, actualize or realize the hope that is meant to be conveyed to us through that term, is to learn to take Sabbath seriously. And that term Sabbath is one that some of you are familiar with. Some of you perhaps have never really heard that term or aren't familiar with what might be meant by it. If you are familiar with the term Sabbath, I want you to shelf anything that you have experienced or associate with the term Sabbath. Just put it on the shelf for the next several minutes during this talk. And I want to just take a clean slate this morning. And we're going to look at Sabbath in a new way. First time we come to the concept of Sabbath is in the very first book of the Bible. The second chapter of the first book of the Bible. And the author of Hebrews in chapter 4 alludes to this in verse 4. Referring to Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, the writer of Hebrews says, "And on the seventh day God rested from His work." Now that might be familiar to you. The Bible tells us that after God created the heavens and the earth, as only God could, God rested. Which begs the question, why did God rest? Why do you think God rested? Did God rest because He was tired? Do you think God was fatigued? Can an omnipotent, all-powerful God grow fatigued? I don't think so. So why did God rest? Well, I think Scripture is clear on this. I think God rested to notice His creation. To take note of its beauty, its intricacy, its completeness, its goodness. I think God rested to enjoy the fruit of His labor. To taste the goodness of His creation. Well, that's where we first encounter or rub up against this term Sabbath. And it's not too far after that we learn something more about this term. In fact, it's in the second book of the Bible, Exodus. Because God knew that Sabbath would be A, good for us, and B, something that we'd have a hard time taking. He made it a commandment in Exodus chapter 20. If you've never read Exodus 20, you probably have heard of the Ten Commandments, and that's where they're first recorded. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. God says, "Remember the Sabbath day." Essentially, He says, "As I rested on the seventh day, so too I want you to enjoy my rest, my gift of rest for you." And so the concept of 1 in 7, 1 day in 7, being a gift to us from God, emerges already in the second book of the Bible. Imagine that, right near the beginning. And God's people enjoyed Sabbath rest in other ways too. You can read in Joshua chapter 22, verse 4, about how the people have finally taken possession of the land that God had promised them. And Joshua says to the people, now God is giving you the rest. The Sabbath that He promised you. And certainly they had rest from having to be in a wilderness where they traveled from place to place, setting up and packing up tents. And living as nomads essentially. And the Israelites enjoyed rest, especially toward the end of King David's reign. The borders had been expanded as far as they would be, and there was peace at the end of David's reign. The borders were secure. Remember that Old Testament concept of peace, of rest. However, by the time of Jesus' day, the religious leaders, called Pharisees, insert what you will, priests, pastors, whatever. The religious leaders had developed so many rules associated with Sabbath that the whole idea of Sabbath rest as being a gift from God had been destroyed. Basically, they forced rest on people. They told you how to rest. And to give you an example of how ridiculous their rules are, I'll just share a couple here. They made a list of 39 jobs, or works that people could not do on the Sabbath, and one of them included preparing food. All right? You're in a culture without refrigeration, without saran wrap, and you can't prepare food on the Sabbath. So whatever you're going to eat, you're going to prepare the day before, and it's going to sit there. How much are you going to enjoy that food on the Sabbath? I'm thinking not too much, unless you're just eating fruit. What's more, they decided that it was okay to walk up to 2/3 of a mile. All right? But if you walk more than 2/3 of a mile, you were working. And that was outlawed. And it's just ridiculous stuff. And this defiling of one of God's most precious gifts to humanity made Jesus sick. I mean, he was livid. And on more than one occasion, the religious leaders of Jesus' day are judging him for the way that he observed Sabbath. Can you imagine that? You're judging Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, on how he chooses to observe Sabbath rest. I mean, that's the equivalent of saying, God, you're not doing a very good job of obeying the fourth commandment. Can you imagine the audacity? Well, on one occasion, Jesus is being judged by his critics on how he observed Sabbath. And Jesus said, this is recorded in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Listen, you critics, the Sabbath was made for mankind, not the other way around, not mankind for the Sabbath. I love the way another translation reads, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. In other words, Sabbath should be more about the things you get to do than about the things you ought to do. And I know there's been loads of debate about, which day, if you're going to observe 1 and 7, which day has to be the right Sabbath? What's the right day to recognize as Sabbath rest? The Jews, following Old Testament law, would say that day is from sundown Friday to sundown on Saturday. A lot of Christians would say, well, we're going to observe Sabbath on Sunday, the first day of the week, the day that Jesus rose from the dead and launched a new era for us. And in my opinion, the debate makes absolutely no sense. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's a waste of time. I think it's a red herring. Because I think Scripture itself speaks definitively on this topic in Romans chapter 14. And you can study that chapter on your own later today, but I'll just highlight one verse in particular. Verse 5, the Apostle Paul, someone with authority, speaking for God, says, one person considers one day more sacred than another person considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in their own mind. All right? I think what he's saying there is that some people are going to observe one day as more sacred than the rest. Others are going to say, you know what? All of life is sacred. God's the Lord of every day. And so they're going to try and live that way. I think Paul would say that the key is that you've got God on your mind. It's not so much about which day of the week a person celebrates Sabbath rest on, but that we're making time to enjoy this gift. Making time for physical, mental, spiritual restoration. Making time to do those things that we enjoy most, doing them with the people that we enjoy most doing them with. Doing the things that make you feel closest to God and to people who are passionate followers of God. I think that's what Sabbath is about. And I think as much as we like the idea of rest, I mean, it's an idea that appeals to us, isn't it? How many of you feel tired? You don't need to raise your hands. Boy, could I use a break, right? How many times don't you say that? Don't you hear that? A lot of mothers are saying that today.